Okay, the success and the passion all helps to build trust, I suppose. That is what
Absolutely.
is important. You have to develop a trust with the organization, with the employees in the organization, to manage them or to mentor them or to guide them or even ask them what you want to do. Then they have to have a trust in you rather than an authorized type of thing or power
Yes.
capacity in servant
Right.
leadership. So you, as a proponent of servant leadership, how has that building trust in others help you, especially during crisis? Because this is this is crisis period. What happens is people become panic and people
Right.
tend not to trust more. And you are a servant leader and still have to develop that trust and keep that trust during this period. How has it helped you, and how did you manage it?
The trust factor is as you mentioned, it's critical. In Patrick Lencioni's Five Dysfunctions of a Team, and he kind of, in a way, rebuilds Maslow's hierarchy of needs. He puts trust right there at the very bottom. It's a basic, very foundational to everything you do. To be able to develop others, they have to trust you and become vulnerable. To have good debate, there has to be a level of vulnerability and trust to be able to debate things and have positive outcomes, because that level of trust is imperative. That trust isn't a flip of a switch, it's developed. I tell my children, trust is earned, not granted. So you have to earn that. In some cases, I've been very fortunate in which people just trusted me early. In my new role at the Women's Center, I was actually very surprised at how quickly people appeared to have trusted me. And then when the moments of crisis come, in which we had one today, not in regards to COVID or anything like that, but we just had a crisis situation. They're coming to me, we're talking it through. We're talking it through with the executive director, with 4 managers, one of which is the first line manager. And I turned to her and said, "What do you think? You're the one that has to work with this. What do you think?" The executive director and I are probably going to be the ones to make the decision, but what is your input? Because you're the one who is on the ground floor. You're the one on the front lines. You're the one that has to experience this. So every time you do that, you're building, in my view, you're building more trust, not in a manipulative way. I don't do those things in a manipulative way to try and get something later. You do those things and the trust begins to build. I believe as we discussed a little earlier, when people recognize the difference between the authentic person who is believing in servant leadership and the one who is just doing it because, this is the current trend and I know I need to do that to survive. Otherwise, I'm going to become a dinosaur, because you can't manage the way you did 50 years ago. It's just not going to make it. Or maybe for a little while longer, but not for much longer. You don't have much of a career left if that's how you're managing. So there are those people who are faking it till they can make it. They try to pull off the fake humility, and with that, most people see right through it. They build no trust. You have to be authentic. You have to build the trust.
Okay, that 3 critical practices of servant leadership are listening, delegating, and connecting employees to a mission, or employees to the mission of the organization. Mm-hmm. That distinguishes servant leadership from other type of leadership in workplace. I think this is very important in crisis situations like COVID, when you should be able to do all 3. But which of these helped you most, and how to overcome this crisis?
I think that listening has to be number 1. It's always number 1. It's you have to listen before you can delegate effectively. The listening always has to be number 1. Whenever any crisis comes out, so many times, and you hear this over and over again, so many times you may not even be able to do anything for that person in their sense of crisis other than just to listen to them and let them vent it out and let them express all that they're going through and all that they're feeling, and just nod along. And sometimes that's really all they needed. But you can't help anyone else. You can't serve. You can't delegate effectively. You can't do anything, in my view, unless you are listening and listening intently.
And connecting the employees to a mission,
Yes.
how much is that important?
Oh, connecting and it is, once again, very much involved, because anytime, and of course my role may be a little unique compared to others. Once again, I've really started focusing more on this nonprofit industry. So the Women's Center of East Texas, where we're focused on domestic violence, we definitely have a strong mission. And so this idea of mission and definitely keeps them focused on why we do what we do. You have to be reminded. Sometimes you get into your daily grind, whether at Mercy Ships, whether at Women's Center of East Texas, at any of these places, you get into your daily grind and sometimes you start forgetting why you do what you do. So it helps to have those reminders. But once again, as important that is, I can't be effective in holding you to the mission if I'm not listening for the things that are skewing you away from it.
Okay, in a book, I have read several books on servant leadership. In one of the book called 7 Pillars of Servant Leadership, the author talks about moments of truth, or there is where you have two choices. One choice is going towards that servant leadership path where you are truly serving the person, and at the other side, it may be profit or whatever it is. You take away for the time being to go to other paths. So there is two paths, right? One is you can take the righteous path or servant leadership path, and then selfish path. We can let us say selfless and selfish path. Yeah. Can you explain two moments? I wanted to say two moments because I want to see how it relates also. So two moments of truth where you had to choose a servant leadership path to a selfish path in your career.
Yeah. One was before I was introduced to the concept of servant leadership. I didn't realize I was doing it at the time, but I was. I used to work at an MHMR center. We did programs for people with mental disabilities, and there were a lot of medication errors. Our $8 an hour workers were helping. They weren't allowed to administer. They would have to help these people with intellectual deficits with their medications. And sometimes, and they were in a group home, so they'd have 3 to 6 of these people to do it with. And they would, and some of them were higher functioning than others. And we had a problem with medication errors. And there was a process to follow, a very strict process that was designed by the nurses. And the problem was I started realizing that half of our people weren't following the process. And it doesn't matter if you discipline them for not following the process because they had created the med errors, they still would not follow the process. When you looked at the process, at some point you got to start listening to the people. And I can continue disciplining everyone for not following this process, or I can listen to the people and observe the issues and say, maybe there's a problem with the process. And after receiving permission from my director, and I believe in order. Okay, so servant leadership, as you still have order. And so I got permission to kind of go beyond my boundaries there a little bit, to go into the medication process and to create a process that made more sense, that was more streamlined for the individuals, so that they didn't try to shortcut the process anymore. Years later, I had one of my employees just raving, saying I was just the best manager she'd ever had, because I would listen to them, and the process that she would keep coming back to, that was just the best thing that helped us. And it wasn't anything that I'd done anything that was just outstanding. It was just a matter of stepping outside for a little bit, and instead of seeing things through my manager eyes of this is how you're supposed to do it, and I'm going to make you continue to do it, I had to look at it from the other person's viewpoint, the employee's viewpoint, and say, wow, this is a long process to have to do with 3 to 6 people, and some of them have 10 medications to take at a time. And so it's a matter of, that was my moment of truth. Like I said, I wasn't even aware of the concept of servant leadership at that time, but when I look back, that was definitely a moment of truth for me, where I said, you can't just keep doing it this way and just keep disciplining the employees for not following it. At some point, you have to start listening to the employees.
It is one of the key traits, of servant leadership, that empathy, able to see through the eyes of others, stepping outside their, our comfort zone, and go step into others' shoes and see what's the problem. That's one of the key traits of servant leadership. So, I would encourage you to tell one more example before we discuss deep into that.
The other example, I struggle to come up with another one, that being a more critical thinker, I tend to think about the mistakes I made, the times where I did not. Mm-hmm. And so one of the reflections when I look back was my very first management role. Mm-hmm. And my entire goal at that time was me as a manager. It was the idea of myself climbing, achieving, and my whole. I worked for a very manipulative boss, and he would fire someone just at nothing. He would just fire someone, and so my management became to tell everyone else, you just sit by the phone and answer the phone, and I'll do everything else, because that was the best way I knew to handle things where it didn't come down on me later.
Right.
And so that was the easiest way for me to control my environment, and that's where managers, I think, miss the mark. Is the desire to control your environment. And if I'm doing everything, and if I've got my hand around everything, I feel safe and I'm controlling. I worked 60 hours a week for, I think, $20,000 a year, but I had control of my environment, and that was then that was a time in which I dropped out of school. I go back to school and I start learning some management concepts, and I start reflecting back on how I'd managed, and I started realizing the mistakes I made. And then as you begin making career choices, you start realizing what does success look like? And when I feel successful is when people have developed, when I've mentored, when I've coached, when I can walk away and I can get that feedback from that individual that saw me years later and said, "Thank you. This was what I needed."